in my own experience, because I stayed both in student accommodation and private accommodation. So I highly recommend student accommodation for when you're first coming over, just because it's guaranteed housing. It's stress-free because they set aside a certain amount of rooms for international students. There's a lot of security where you're staying, because there's a few, but the main ones would be Core Village and Goldcrest. So like they have the secure gates and they have security guards there, and you'd have to show your ID to get in. So there's that sense of security there. And there's washer and dryer units in-house. And I know I stayed in Goldcrest, and all the rooms there are en suite, which means they have their own bathrooms. They also have like a ping pong table room. They have a TV room. They have a bunch of things there. So it's really cool to stay. And payments are made in 2 installments instead of monthly. And the rate includes like the electric and Wi-Fi. So there's no kind of like hidden fees. So you know what you're getting into and you can save up that money beforehand. Whereas if you rent privately, you're not quite sure what your rent's going to be right away until you find a place. And then Wi-Fi and electric kind of changes. The one thing I will say that is, if you're going into student accommodation, the Irish students, they tend to leave every weekend. Because they all have jobs and they all like to go home. So try to make other international friends, just so you're not alone there. But it's definitely a fun place to live because you're living with all students, and there's always something happening during the week. There's always something to do. There's always some seminars going on, little like workshops, projects. They're really great about all that. And you're right on campus. You're just on the north side. So you're right by the business building and the nursing building and the engineering building. And but the thing about student accommodation is it can be a little bit more expensive than private. You are paying for that added security and that guarantee of a housing before you leave. That being said, I don't know if I would have wanted to go straight to private housing right when I moved to Ireland. I'm originally from Chicago, so when I first started going into private housing, there was things that I didn't quite know what to look out for, like electricity, gas, oil, bins, all these kind of hidden utility bills that you have to watch out for. And it was just a nice intro into the Irish way of life, because I don't know about your countries, but back home in the States, we recycle, but Ireland recycles a lot more. So like we were getting in trouble a lot in the apartment I was staying in Goldcrest, because we were throwing the glass bottles and recycling. So they gave us a lot of pamphlets and things on how to properly recycle, which I think was helpful. And then just in terms of just adjusting to the different sizes of fridges and how food lasts and things like that, it was the one less stress to worry about when you're already stressed moving to a different country. And then another thing I wanted to note is that important terms when you're renting in Ireland in general is there's 3 or 4 different types of rooms. So there's a twin room, which means you are sharing with another person. There is a single room, which means it's a single bed in your own private room. And then a double bed, or a double room, is a double bed in your own private room. And then en suite means you have your own private bathroom. So then I stayed in student accommodation. I think I moved out in March. So I was in there for a good few months, but I had just found a great location just across the street from campus. So I moved out a bit earlier. Another important thing to note when you're renting privately is you're not trying to get a group of people and rent a house together. You are going out on your own and renting a room from a house where you might not necessarily know the people. And it's a bit easier to just go out on your own and try to find a room. I had the most luck finding a house on the Facebook page called Galway House Hunting. It's actually Galway House Hunting for sound people. And then the other sites that people use are daft.ie. And sometimes you get good luck with Galway Advertiser. Just the thing with those sites is that they're very popular. So you kind of have to always be on them when you're looking for a house, always commenting, always talking to people, and just be very aware that you will find a house, but if you're renting privately, it might just take a bit longer. But I do find that renting in Ireland is a bit more relaxed. Like if you do sign a lease for a certain amount of time, you can leave before the lease ends. You just have to find someone to take over the rest of your lease and they'll just take over. So it's a bit more relaxed in that sense that you're not just stuck down to a place for a year. I've stayed in 3 private accommodations in Galway since I've lived here. So I was living in Fairlands for about a year. It's right across the street from NUIG in like Cora Village. I was living with 4 others, and I originally had a single room in the house, and then a girl moved out, so I was able to kind of move up into her double room, and I still paid the same price and rent. That's an important thing to note, is that some house situations, you start out in the smallest room and then you slowly work your way up. I was paying $400 a month there. And then I moved just down the road from Fairlands, and I was paying $450 a month for a double room, but it was a brand new house, completely renovated, very nice, just across from Corrid Village. I now just recently moved into town. So I'm about 2-minute walk from the city center. And when you're living in the city center, it's going to be a bit more expensive and the places are going to be a bit more smaller. But if you're living in the city, you're still close to campus because the campus is never that far. And you'd be close to everything happening in the city. And it's a little bit easier to get groceries and those things. And right now I live with only just 2 others. So it's just kind of a smaller little attached house. The things to pay attention to when renting privately is don't pay any money until you've seen the place. Some woman tried to scam me before I moved to Ireland by trying to get a deposit before I'd even seen it. Luckily, I kind of realized it was a scam and I didn't send her any money. So just be wary of people asking for money before you've seen anything. Make sure to ask what the extra expenses are. Some things would be like gas, oil, electric, Wi-Fi, and bins. Some places have radiators, so that would be the oil. So you'd kind of buy a big bulk of it, and then you'd be able to use it for a few months. And then I was kind of looking up the average rent in Galway. So the average rent for a single room would range anything from $300 to $400 a month. It just depends on the location. The average rent for a double room would go anywhere from $350 to $550. And the average rent for a studio apartment is $750 to $1,000. Those are just very hard to come by, which is why they're a bit more expensive. And another thing is whenever you're looking at a place, just kind of pay attention to the house, like how it looks. Are there locks on your doors? Do they seem to have a good relationship with the landlord? Just make sure to try to put yourself in the best situation and don't be afraid to ask them questions. So I think that's kind of all my advice in terms of renting in student accommodation and renting privately. I definitely recommend starting out in student accommodation just to make your life a little bit easier. And then once you get your bearings, move to private accommodation. So give it back to Neve.
Perfect. Thanks, Kerry. You shared with such great insights there. So thank you so much. And I think the whole group can really appreciate that. So I might hand over to Rachel, and if you want to share your insights and your expertise.
Sure. Thanks a million, Neil. And thanks, Kerry. You made some really good points. It's nice to hear tenancy advice, but not from a housing advisor. It's just a different perspective. And I think the whole idea of moving into, that whole idea of moving into a purpose-built student accommodation centre before you go into the private sphere is definitely a good, that's definitely a good shout. So I have a bit of a slideshow here now for you, and I'll just share it. Is that okay? Can you see that? Yeah. Okay. So this is just, I suppose, we at Threshold, I might as well, wait one second. Here we go. So Threshold, who we are. So we're a tenancy advice service. We're a charity. We're offering free independent advocacy and representation where it's required. So what I mean by that is if there was any issue with a normal, typical tenancy, you could go through a dispute process to resolve that. But we'll get into that later. So we offer advice on tenants' rights, we campaign for legal and policy changes, and then we're available to contact with you via phone, email, web chat, video consultations, and face-to-face. So our information is there. Now that free phone number, just so you're aware, it won't work from the international mobile phones. I'll actually have to look that number up for you at the end, but I'll get it for you. But for now, so student accommodation options for you guys, obviously home wouldn't be an option because you're all coming here, but private rented is the most typical. You'd have on campus, purpose-built student accommodation, and then there's digs as well. So an example of on-campus accommodation would be UCD, so a large amount of people sharing a property, a high rent, so 8,000, but to include all of your utilities, your refuse, your bike storage, gym, and sometimes there's like laundry facilities and meeting areas, like Kerry was saying, the ping pong tables. So then on-campus accommodation is owned by the colleges. It's not owned privately. So you're kind of, like Kerry said, you're guaranteed a good level of security in these places. Your student union will be able to assist you with renting in these kind of accommodations, you know. So then in terms of purpose-built student accommodation, this is the privately built, similar to on campus, but it's privately owned. We have the Westwood here in Galway, which has 399 beds. So just an example, it starts at about 6,396 a year, and then you get all of those other little extras, and they would be kind of form part of the conditions of the lease as well. So if there was any issue to accessing something that you were promised, you would be able to assert your rights to try and get that sorted out. So I mean, if you couldn't get access to the bike storage, you should be able to sort that. So then digs are a kind of more traditional sort of a setting for students. There's not as many of them around as there once were, but typically you'd be sharing with the owner or their family. They might include a few meals a week. They might include some laundry. There might be time restrictions. So those kind of ones obviously wouldn't suit yourselves who are looking for a sort of a full-time accommodation. But the important thing about these type of agreements is that they're considered to be license agreements. And I'll go into license agreements a little bit more, but essentially a license agreement, your guests are akin to guests' rights. So if the owner of the property changed their mind and didn't want you to be there, there's no legislation that says you have rights to stay. Your rights to remain in the property can never supersede their own as their home, you know. Private rented accommodation. So seeking private rented accommodation, as Kerry said, it has risks. First-time renters and international students in particular are susceptible to scams and are actually, they're targeted by these scammers, you know. So never agree to pay any money without having seen the property or without having done your homework about who it is that you're renting from. If you're in doubt, walk away and report your scam to the Gardaí. And if it looks too good to be true, unfortunately, it probably is. More often than not, there can be adverts that might have very few details on the ownership side, but there's big lovely story to tell on the left hand side where you're reading the content about the property, and you need to be very wise to that. Or if there's only, you know, a first name, if you're searching in the private rented accommodation sphere and you see that it's an agency posting the ad, you have a lot more security then, because you know that they're an operating and they have to comply with legislation. There's a lot of legislation to comply with as well. So they're just two examples now. I mean, that's a story at the end of May and another one at the start of July, less than kind of just over the month between each other. It's a very prevalent issue at the moment. So that leads me on to deposits, which is another place where international students are unfortunately getting scammed. It's just a fact of the matter. So pre-tenancy issues. We'll start with pre-tenancy issues. You've paid your deposit up front for a place, you've secured somewhere else that's nicer in the meantime, and you want to try and get that deposit back. You won't be able to access the RTB, which is the the Residential Tenancies Board, who hear disputes in relation to landlord-tenant issues. This is because unless you've taken the keys and you've moved in, contracts are signed, your tenancy hasn't yet commenced, and that's an important factor in the law, is the commencement of the tenancy. So if you've paid a holding deposit, that might not necessarily be refundable. Be careful of holding deposits. Security deposits, however, if you've paid it to the landlord, you should be able to go through the small claims court to seek a refund if it was, for example, them who changed their mind and then they didn't want to give you your deposit back. In these kind of situations, the best thing you can do is actually just give us a ring. A housing advisor would be appointed to kind of go through that issue with you. So back to deposits, I suppose we've called for a definition on deposits because it's very much a grey area still in the law. It's not defined anywhere within legislation. And as part of that, we've also called for the introduction of a deposit protection scheme, which would go a long way to protecting international students from getting their deposits retained unfairly, and which is something that can often happen. So if you'd like to sign our campaign, the little link is on the bottom right there, and our Threshold website, if you wanted to kind of have a look on any issue, it's very good for advice. We have a lot of advice up there too. So new legislation was brought in on the 9th of July. Some of the legislation wasn't enacted immediately, but this legislation has actually brought a lot of improvements and increased protections for tenants such as yourselves. So Kerry actually touched on the moiety payment, on the lump sum payment for your semester. Well, that's now illegal. And from the 9th of August, a landlord cannot request a lump sum for a semester. You certainly, as international students, sometimes this suits you better, you can still opt in to pay in this way. However, you cannot be forced to do this if you do not want to. Now, it's important to note that that is from the 9th of August. So if you have your tenancy already agreed at this point, maybe get in contact with us so we can go through that with you. So the deposit as well, another thing that's happened is often in Ireland you'd see deposit is 2,400, rent is 1,200. That can't happen now either. Deposits have to be, they can't be greater than the value of 1 month's rent. So you're never losing out on more than 1 month's rent. Then another thing, I suppose, Kerry kind of touched on this as well, which is when you're trying to get out of a fixed term lease, if the property is shared, you can try and find a replacement. But if, say, you're in the property on your own, it'll be a little bit more tricky. However, in student-specific accommodation, tenants are only required to give 28 days notice now, which is just a huge boon for you. So during COVID, obviously, there were so many tenants who lost out on significant amounts of money because they'd paid a moiety, there was no college, they had to just go home, and the majority of them probably didn't try even to terminate their tenancy. They just went through it and understood. And were then trying to seek refunds after the fact, having not terminated their tenancy correctly. So this just means, say you wanted to drop out of your course or move home or something happened, that it's only a 28-day and you can't be held liable for longer than that period, which is great. But giving notice in Ireland has gotten so complex recently. I would suggest that you contact us if you're thinking about doing that. So during the tenancy, there might be a couple of different issues. Access to your home is one of them, particularly in where you're in like a student specific place. So ensuring tenants have peaceful occupation of their properties, that's written into the legislation, and it protects you from the landlord just arriving in without your notice and, you know, I don't know, doing repairs without you knowing about it, or being in a house without you having any clue. They have to give you advance notice and you have to consent. If you're not comfortable to consent, you can propose another date, but you can't unreasonably withhold access. The one thing is, however, is that they can only enter the property for the reason of inspection or to carry out repairs. They can't just walk in and out as it pleases, you know. You can have guests and visitors, but the rules in relation to pets are, like, I'm sure this is the case in every country, but you need to check your conditions of your lease if you have a pet, which you probably won't in fairness, but if you do, just make sure that you get written consent from your landlord for that pet. Otherwise, you could be seen as breaching your obligations as a tenant, and that is one of the permitted reasons for terminating tenancies under the legislation. So maintenance then, private accommodation must meet basic minimum standards. The landlord is obliged to carry out repairs, and to, I suppose, these should be completed within a reasonable time. You should ensure that you report any repairs, any and all repairs issues in writing. Never do it over the phone. Well, I mean, if you want to follow up on the phone, then that's fine, but you need to ensure that you have a record of reporting repairs, because then if it goes back and they're not prompt in carrying out these repairs, or you're left with a big leak for weeks, you have evidence of formally notifying the landlord, which would serve you later down the line were a dispute or anything like that required. So again, if standards and repairs issues are a thing, just come back and contact us on them. So sharing with others and searching for a tenant for a room. It can be a little bit trickier in terms of your tenancy rights than a normal individual tenancy, or renting from a purpose-built or a student-specific accommodation. If you're finding a property on house hunting, for example, the chances are that you're moving into an existing agreement. And if you haven't met the landlord and you're paying a tenant directly, the chances are you don't have a tenancy. Again, you have what's referred to as a license agreement. So license agreements cover kind of a pretty big cohort of normal tenancies, which make up a huge portion of the Irish rental sector. And a lot of people aren't aware that they don't have rights. So it's important that if you are moving into a situation where you're paying a tenant directly, that you agree and you set out conditions which are to your benefit. So if she wants you to leave, she'll give you notice. If you want to leave, you'll give her notice and you'll find a replacement. So talking these things out from the start, it's the best, because you're going to have to compromise further down the line otherwise. So these license agreements, again, they're not covered by law, so you can be left in a situation, say for example, you didn't give you needed to move out tomorrow, you left, found any replacement, it's very unlikely you'll get any deposit back in that situation. So it's, sorry now, I'm getting a little bit waylaid. So yeah, so normal landlord laws such as the entitlement to a rent book, minimum notice periods, they don't apply. Deposit issues can be brought to the small claims court, but only where you have paid that deposit to the landlord. You won't be able to bring it, the small claims court won't hear any cases between tenants because it's unregulated. And then the head tenant isn't deemed the service provider. So that's how they just did. I suppose I don't know where I'm going with that. That's how they work anyway. So ending a tenancy then, as I said before, it can be very tricky. Getting back your deposit issues, I suppose on that end, taking pictures when you move in and before you move out of a property is a great idea because you have something to compare. If you have to go to a dispute, you have evidence of being a good tenant. So there's no actual legal requirement for a final inspection of a property. We would always recommend the tenants try to carry out a joint inspection, particularly international tenants, because you won't have a chance to see that person face to face again. It gives you another opportunity to leave a good impression. The deposit doesn't have to be returned on the day. It must be returned promptly. This is the specific language used in the legislation. So I suppose in that the legislation takes into account that if damage was caused, a landlord should be given time to sort it out and then the deductions forwarded to you. If a deduction was ever made of your deposit, you have every entitlement to see receipts for that. So you should ensure when you're leaving that all bills and rent have been paid, that you've fully cleaned the property, the oven, defrosted the freezer if it's gone frosty. And actually deposits, the way the RTB look at deposits, they're kind of protected, you know, really ring fenced, and unless there's damage, significant damage or a financial loss incurred by the landlord because of the tenant, then they're not going to be having them retaining deposits. One issue is if you don't have your landlord's address, you're not going to be able to take an RTB dispute for that deposit. So make sure that the landlord's address is given to you, you know, and if you're having trouble and he hasn't given it to you, again, contact us. We can do a little bit of jiggery pokery and figure things out for you if we can. And certainly we can give advice on those sort of dispute issues. So there's our contact details. As I said, the 1-800 number is actually, it doesn't work on international phone. Sorry, now I'm going to have to, I'm going to have to dig out my Outlook. International number.
We can post it on our website as well, Rachel, once you find it.
I might do it that way just because I'll have to dig through actual emails now to try and find it.
Problem.
So yeah, any questions at all, fire them my way, that's fine.
Million. There are a few questions that have come into the chat box, so I think Niamh and I are going to pose them to yourself and Kerry now, if that suits.
Perfect.
So one student asked, is there a fee for your services?
For threshold, no.
Yeah.
No fee. But we are a charity and you can make a donation if you like.
Okay, thank you. And Niamh, do you want to ask one now while I find another one?
Yeah, sure. So another student has asked, I've heard about renting private without signing a formal lease. What might be the possibilities and risks with that? Is it common practice?
More common than you would realize. Very, very common thing, actually. The one good thing about Irish legislation is that we have really bulked up on the fact that there are these verbal agreements in place. And this is called Part 4 tenancy rights. They're written into the legislation, the Residential Tenancies Act, which state that once you've occupied a property for more than 6 months, you become what's known as a Part 4 tenant and actually have rights to remain in that property for a further 5.5 years. And that's just the way it's considered. Now, there are a number of categories under which your landlord will be able to terminate a Part 4 agreement. But after the 6-month point, what's important is that he can't give you no reason. He can't just say, get out. He has to, at all stages, give you notice in writing. But up until the 6-month point, he's entitled to terminate the tenancy with 28 days notice for no reason at all. After that point, he must give an increased notice period. So that goes up, it actually goes up to 90 days notice after the 6-month point, which is great for you because just have that stronger legislation and you have a bit more time to find something if you need to go looking. The reasons are very restrictive. They're sale, own use, change of use, landlord or a family member moving back in. I think I might have said one twice. And then there is on the other side of it, a breach of obligations. So you can breach your obligations either by breaching a physical obligation. I don't know, you've broken a door and you haven't repaired it when the landlord has asked you to do so. Or else there's the financial side, which is a breach for rent arrears. Rent shouldn't ever be withheld in an Irish tenancy. This opens you up to a termination notice being issued. You'll be issued first with the 28-day warning notice, whereby they will ask you to comply and pay the arrears. If you don't comply, you will be given another notice of termination. So that's a really important one on the rent. Definitely don't withhold it. Even if the landlord isn't doing work, just get in touch with us and we can help you from there, you know.
Great, that's great. Thanks a million, Rachel.
No
Another question that's come in, and it's come up quite a bit, so so this is for lots of you asking, are the student accommodations full, and where else would you recommend to look for accommodation? So while this chat was ongoing, I spoke to the accommodation office, who confirmed that all campus and off-campus but university associated residents are fully booked, but they are still accepting applications to go on the wait list. Now in September, our undergraduate students will be all will be starting, but Irish undergraduate students will have provisionally booked accommodation in the hopes that they secure a place at NUI Galway in September. But they won't find out until September if they have secured that place. So it's likely that places will open up again in September. So we'd advise you to get an application into the waiting list to see, first of all, might you get a place then in September. There's also, you can search the private rental market accommodation. There are still places available, and you can see that on the website. They have a count of rooms available, and they also have something called Student Pad. So I'll post those links onto the website. The accommodation office do advise to book temporary accommodation, like hostels, for example, or apart hotels where you can stay short term until you can find something when you get here. You could also connect with current international postgraduate students who will all be leaving their accommodation in the next couple of weeks. So that's another avenue that you could try. And then Kerry, I might just ask you, what are the other places that you mentioned to look for accommodation, and I'll pop them into the chat box.
Perfect. So they're on Facebook. There's one called Galway House Hunters for Sound People. That's kind of the main one. There's posts there every 2 minutes. Then there's daft.ie and Galway Advertiser. I think someone asked a question about the Irish Advertiser. So it's called Galway Advertiser, and you can just Google it and go to the housing page, and you'll see like that would be where you'd most likely find a house instead of a room to rent. Like if there was a group of you trying to find somewhere to rent. So
That's great. Thanks, Kerry.
welcome.
So
Niamh, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, so one question that has come in, and this has come in quite a few times as well, how do international students provide landlord references? So this comes up quite a bit. So how do you provide a reference when you haven't stayed in the country before? The advice that we give, and Rachel, you might have some insights on this as well, but the advice from the international office is to show, after you register, if you can show the landlords your registration from university, to show them that you will be staying in Galway for the next year or however long it is. Rachel, do you have any insights on that?
Kind of a funny one. References can sometimes present a bit of an issue. I think particularly where landlords are going out and they understand that it's a student coming in, they are aware that there's going to be like this might be their first time renting. So it's a funny one, really. Good advice to show the registration. We always say if you had an employment reference, or if you have something from home, just to show them, you know, your application won't be solely decided on references. And particularly where you're a student, they will be more lenient in those kind of cases, you know.
Perfect. Thank you, Rachel.
Rachel, I have a question for you now. Should students pay a deposit before getting the tenancy agreement, or should they pay after?
Tenants should pay the deposit when they're moving into the property. The day that the keys, they should be trying to get the agreement to pay on the same day that they're moving in. We don't recommend that they pay in advance. If it's an agent or a purpose-built student accommodation office, then I mean, these people need to comply, but certainly with an individual landlord, we would say don't pay until you've got the keys in your hand. Also, always look for a receipt.
Thank you, Rachel. Somebody asked, will an email to the landlord for repairs like water leaks be counted as formal written notice?
Yeah, it would certainly, like, you know, you're going to be able to print off that email with the timestamp on it. That definitely serves as evidence. Sometimes text messages, they just don't hold up as well in a court setting, but they're still considered. Like anything written it's much better to have the agreement in writing than verbally, because you can't look back on that if a dispute arises.
Rachel, there's been a couple of comments about payments on campus accommodation and if they will be in 6 or 8 payment options. They're carrying out a survey at the moment, which is open until the 13th of August. So I think they will update you after the 13th of August. We don't have any ideas about that just now because there's still a little bit of time left in that survey, but the accommodation office will be in touch with you about it. And for all those asking if we can share the session or the PowerPoint, the session will be available in the join in link where you access this meeting. You'll be able to watch it from there from later on or tomorrow.
Another question has just come in, and maybe Kerry, you could touch on this. For campus accommodation, how will roommates be allotted to the apartment? Will students of the same academic course, i.e. first year students, be put together?
So with that, it's kind of luck of the draw. When I was living in Goldcrest, I think the first semester because there were 6 of us in the, it's basically an apartment. The 5 girls were all study abroad from Boston College in the States. So they were only there for a semester. I think 1 was a nursing degree, 2 were English, 1 was special education. They were just kind of all over the place. And then second semester, I had different study abroad people. There was 2 from Germany and then 3 from the States. So it just kind of depends. I think what they sometimes do is they do put international students together. But I have heard a few cases of people living with Irish like roommates. It just kind of depends, but they wouldn't specifically put you in an apartment with people in your same course, but that could happen. So
Perfect. Thanks, Kerry. I do think it is kind of luck of the draw who you were buddied up with, which is good because it provides an opportunity to meet people that you wouldn't have necessarily met beforehand.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So somebody else asks, when renting privately, are there any documents required to apply for rent? In the United States, we usually have to show paychecks to show we earn 3 times the monthly rents. Is there something similar in Ireland, or is it a different process for securing accommodation?
Landlords will ask for a lot of different information at the moment. Some of these are what we call GDPR breaches. So GDPR is the general data policy rules handed down by the EU. So what we in Threshold would consider a breach would be being asked for a copy of your statements, maybe your PPS number, not so much, because that would be something they need to register your tenancy with. I don't know as international students what the deal is with PPS numbers, but sorry, now I'm after getting sidelined. They'll ask for a lot. So references are the first thing. If you're generally where you're looking at student properties, I can't imagine that they're going to be looking for work references. They might ask for a whole load of things, but if you're just upfront and honest, it may not necessarily be an excluding factor that you're unable to provide some of these things. A lot of these guys just want to have your information. If you're concerned about information being requested of you, do get in touch with us because we can go through the general data policy rules in more detail with you, you know.
Yeah, and I think it's with the private accommodation, I've never been asked to prove that I can afford anything.
No.
Yeah, it's a bit more casual in that sense. Like it wouldn't be like home, like in the States where they have all these things they need. They just basically either like you can pay or you can't, and if you can't pay, then they start that process.
Yeah.
So
which brings me on actually to a question of payment. Should it be done online through an Irish bank, or could it be done in cash?
You should try and avoid paying cash if you can. Definitely try and avoid paying cash if you can. If your landlord's looking for cash, look for a rent book. You know, we have rent books in Threshold if you'd need to get them off us, but paying a bank, it just means that you have a record in your account, something to fall back on if there's any difficulties or if there's any allegations of arrears.
And maybe both of you might be able to answer this. Do you have any advice on how to live successfully with new people? And then maybe what to do if you don't really get on with your housemates, or if there's an issue there that you can't solve yourself?
So in terms of issues with housemates, there's no, I suppose from our perspective, we actually won't even get involved in an intertenant issue because this is something that's unregulated. We also couldn't, you know, it represents a conflict for us because we'd be advising one tenant and then another advisor could be advising another tenant, and then we're fighting and you're fighting and we're going nowhere kind of thing. What we can advise on is the law. So these situations are unregulated. Really, the only way that you can sort these things out is by being courteous and compromising with each other, you know. If you're in a difficult situation and you feel ganged up on, say, by 3 other tenants, you need to kind of look at your own situation and say, am I going to be happier somewhere else? Do I even want to stay here with these people, you know? Or it could be vice versa. So the one thing is that no one tenant in a shared agreement has more rights than another tenant. So it's never going to be a case where you can rally up and kick someone out without them agreeing to it. You need to try and work through these things in a personable and friendly way if you can.
Yeah, I
Do your
think
best to be a good human.
yeah, I think a big thing about living with others is having realistic expectations. Like when I was living with the 4 other people, so there's 5 in the house, I tried to have a really realistic expectation of, you know, like the mess in the house and the noise. Like it wasn't going to be perfectly clean because there was a lot of people, and it wasn't going to be the quietest because there was, again, just so many of us. And then I think being open and transparent and not letting things build up. Like if there is an issue, kind of address it right away, but not in an accusatory way. Just kind of like if you notice things are messy, just say, oh guys, like maybe we should do like a cleaning schedule. And just, I think an open line of communication with everyone is the best way. But also, as you were saying, if you, because my last house I moved out because I had a disagreement with the 3 of them, and I decided I wasn't happy there and I was better off just leaving before it got worse. So, you know.
Sometimes it's the only way to deal with these kind of things, you know?
Yeah, and in that way I was able to keep a good relationship with the landlord. Because that's, at the end of the day, you always want, like, housemates come and go, but you do want to keep a good relationship with the landlord because Galway is small and everyone does know each other, and that is going to be a good reference for you.
Exactly.
The reference is important too.
It is.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Alison has asked as well. So Alison's from the US. She says she can't be here until late August. Would you feel comfortable making an agreement through a virtual viewing?
Yes, I think so, but it would need to be a case of you need to make sure who they are. You need to verify who they are. So if that's a case of getting someone here to go and view the property, someone you might know who's over here studying, it just means that you've got that extra bit of peace of mind. Just obviously, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
You need to be careful, you know.
One other question is it easiest to search for a house as a group or search for a room in a shared house?
I think a room would probably be easier, Kerry, would it?
Yeah, no, a house is, when you're searching for a house like a group of people, it's a lot harder to find, and it's, from what I've heard from people trying it, it can be a bit more expensive. I know a girl that's been searching for a house to like, her and I think 3 of her friends are trying to find a house, and they've been looking for 3 months and they've had no luck, so they're probably going to have to separate and just find a room themselves.
I saw rent on Dash there earlier, €3,100 for a 4-bed in Galway, and I just, the problem is if you're looking for a whole house, you're competing with every other person in the private rental sphere, including all the people who are looking for social housing and HAP as well. So individual room is definitely going to be easier for you to find. There's just it's a lot more transient kind of.
And are there rental agents in Galway if students wanted to work with a rental agent?
So letting agents are a funny one now in Ireland because they never really kind of go out looking. It's not like having a real estate agent going out to the market and showing you all these lovely bedrooms. Like that's not the reality, unfortunately. A letting agent is someone who needs to comply with legislation and would be very easily pressured if things were going wrong in the property. I would definitely recommend agents are like, you know, they have a code of ethics that they need to adhere to. So agents are good, but they're not house hunters.
They'd probably be more managed, like almost property managers, where they have an assigned.
Yeah, so the agent is an agent of the landlord, but he's never going to be your agent looking for your property for you. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, that's a really good point.
Somebody else asked, and I think this is a good question as well, that when you move into the house, do the landlords help with minor issues? For example, if there's a problem with the heating and if there needs a bit of repair, can you expect the landlord to repair that? Is the onus on him?
Yes.
Certainly, yeah. The landlord is obliged. So heating, number one, is like considered like up there. We're cold people here in Ireland, so heating is like, you know, get my heating sorted. So we actually have an information page on standards and repairs on our website, which details what you can expect as minimum standards. So heating, sanitation, fridge, storage, things like that. And if anything is broken, it's considered a breach if he doesn't fix it. So yeah, landlord's obliged to do pretty much the whole lot of it.
Perfect, thank you. And there was another question as well, and I can't find it now, but it was about, do the university check the legitimacy of landlords? And no, the university is totally separate in that regard.
No, and checking the legitimacy of landlords can be very tricky in Ireland as well, because there is no register of private landlords in Ireland. There's just not. There's a registration that the landlord is required and obliged to undertake, but there are still a lot of people who don't register tenancies. That doesn't mean you can't access your rights. It just means that something dodgy is probably going on the other side, or maybe he's just too cheap to pay the fee, or I don't know. But the best way that you can check ownership, like, get in contact with us. We can do a little bit of digging if you're unsure on anything. There's no problem there.
There's a good question about a BRR rating for a house. So that is the energy rating on a house. Mm-hmm. So it goes from A to F, I think. Mm-hmm. And a house with an A BRR rating is really, really like super efficient. And that's like, you know, your really high efficiency homes. So the cost.
Basically, the A-rated homes are kind of these newly built, super insulated. They might have an air exchange unit. A lot of the apartment blocks would have A ratings because they've been recently built. Or though in private houses, individual houses, I mean, I actually did BER ratings in college, and it's something that is open to interpretation depending on which engineer is carrying out the survey. Obviously, if it's a G or an F rating, it's going to be a bit of a cold house. And, you know, when you sign up for the property, you're taking what you get, and anything that isn't compliant, you can expect the landlord to sort it out. But if this is a kind of a habitual thing that he doesn't do, you might run into issues. So again, it's a thing of call us.
Yeah, the lower the rating, kind of maybe colder the house will be, or the more expensive it will be to heat it up.
Yes, definitely.
So there are things to consider, and you know, it does get chilly here in the winter. You know, but do things to make sure that even if your house is a little cold, you're warm. You know, hot water bottles, snuggy blankets, all that kind of thing, so that it's not uncomfortable for yourselves. They're just some things to think about.
Yeah. And heating is a big thing, you know. If there's heating gone in a property, it's considered urgent. Priority issue should be fixed within 2 to 3 days. If you've sent 2 letters and the landlord still hasn't sorted it, you can take a dispute against him. Hopefully that won't ever be required.
There's another similar question, Rachel. Yeah. Could you advise on what students could do if there's mold or mildew in their accommodation? Is the landlord obliged to rectify this, which is quite a common problem in the west of Ireland? It's
such a common problem. It's such a common issue where an agent may not kind of consider it, or they might try and even put the blame back on you as the tenant for just breathing. So essentially, you need to just keep chipping away at it. If it's caused as a result of some sort of a structural issue, and you need to go to the full lengths to try and get that sorted, unfortunately, you're at the mercy of the justice system here in Ireland, you know. You are going to have to go through a dispute if he refuses. But we can help and we can advocate to the landlord on your behalf. We could send letters. It's something that can be dealt with. It's just an awful dose having to do it, you know.
Perfect. Thank you, Rachel. So we're near the end. So I might ask one more question. I saw Kevin had his hand up for a few minutes there and we didn't get around to him. Kevin, if you want to ask your question, you want to take yourself off mute? No? Okay. I might ask one more question. So what necessary things should we look into a house or an apartment before renting it? So Rachel, what are the essential things that you think need to be included?
It just depends. That's an open and a broad question. It definitely depends on your situation. The standard, as we said, landlords are obliged to meet minimum standards. Minimum standards mean everything needs to be in good condition. The property needs to be structurally sound. Heating, washer, all of these things need to be provided. If you don't have if you're in an apartment, they need to provide you a clothes dryer. If you're in a house, a washing line or a clothes dryer. I don't know, it's kind of a broad question, I'm sorry.
There was a good question about drinking tap water in Galway. It is drinkable.
It is, but it doesn't taste nice in some houses. I lived in a house on just off Dominic Street and it wasn't great. Brita filter, get yourself a Brita filter.
And they're not too expensive. You can buy them in like the supermarket.
Oh,
I drink my tap water here, but it's definitely different from when I go back to my family house. Like I know I'm drinking Galway water, but it's just different, but it's safe.
If you're living in a property which is out in the country and it's on its own group scheme, then buy bottled water or get a Brita filter, you know. It's just, I suppose, group schemes are responsible for their own facilities, and I suppose as a tenant you would be aware if you were getting it, but I think for the most part you'll all be in the city and hopefully in some of the nicer places.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Rachel and Kerry, for all those amazing insights. I think you covered so much there. There's still loads of questions coming in. But maybe if you want to hold off your questions, and you can always email us in the international office or reach out directly to Threshold. And Kerry had her contact details up on her slide, and we'll share them as well on our website if you have any more specific questions in regards to tenants' rights and all of that. So,
Thanks a million.
No problem.
Thank you so much for joining. Yeah. So good to get your insights, both of you.
Grand. Get in touch at any point.
Thanks a million. So I'm going to wrap up now. Thank you all so much for joining, and I hope that you found this session as useful. I know I did. I learned a lot off both speakers. So thank you all very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.